The T20 Cricket World Cup in the Caribbean and the USA is just around the corner. Cricket South Africa have picked the best available side for the tournament, one that makes no concessions to affirmative selection. This is fascinating in itself. Might this be the Proteas tournament? We certainly hope so. Welcome to the Luke Alfred Show. I have 30 years of experience on the front lines of sports journalism, covering some of the biggest games in cricket, rugby, the FIFA World Cup, and even the Olympic Games. Come and join me as we learn about some of the greatest sports stories you've never heard. I'm Luke Alfred, and welcome to the show. Something rare happened a couple of weeks ago as the Proteas team for the T20 World Cup in the Caribbean and the USA was announced. What happened was that a national cricket team was picked on merit, an occasion not dissimilar to a lunar eclipse or the unusual event of Mercury passing across the face of the sun. In this selection, there were no marginal selections. There were no iffy choices. A marginal choice player was not picked primarily to keep the social engineers at Cricket South Africa happy. For this, we should rejoice. And we should rejoice that white ball coach Rob Walter and director of cricket Enoch Nkwe have had the guts to pick a side they think capable of winning a World Cup. It's a statement of intent, and it says, in selection at least, there will be no excuses. The media's response to the selection of the side has been muted. It is difficult to say why. Perhaps it's because there's simply too much sport in the sporting universe and we are swamped. Perhaps we are not thinking cricket, with the domestic season just having spluttered to an underwhelming end. Perhaps it has something to do with the heaviness of heart that greets another pre-World Cup period. Such heaviness of heart is part legitimate fatigue, part a kind of pre-tournament insurance which inoculates us long-suffering fans against probable disappointment. There have been so many defeats in Cricket World Cups, going back to the absurd rain rule in the semi-final against England at the Sydney Cricket Ground in the 1992 World Cup, that to expect anything different this time around seems tantamount to expecting too much. We have grown used to such painful defeats that they seem almost preordained. In the same way that we have grown used to the Springboks going to a Rugby World Cup with at least a fighting chance of success, so we have grown used to the Proteas going to a Cricket World Cup with a fighting chance of, well, not achieving success. They do so further in the most unique or imaginative or nerve-shredding way possible. In terms of finding creative ways to be unsuccessful, they are indeed world champions. It's horrible to contemplate, but true to utter, isn't it? This time seems no different, although it differs from previous World Cups in that selection, and therefore team cohesion, can't be used as an excuse for the defeat in a vital knockout game we sense is just around the corner. Good journalism is worth nothing if it doesn't provide counterfactual arguments. Yes, the long shadow of underachievement and disappointment hangs over the Proteas. Remember hosting the 2003 Cricket World Cup, for example, in which all was set for a stellar tournament for Lance Klusener and company, only for South Africa to start badly by losing their opening match against the West Indies at Newlands. The defeat, although narrow, set the tone, and all was to go belly up a couple of weeks later in the rain against Sri Lanka at Kingsmead, when we didn't realize what was going on soon enough, and Nicky Boyer didn't get the right message onto the field soon enough, and Mark Boucher didn't score 2 runs soon enough. It was a wet evening, and we all went home feeling very soggy for ourselves. The South African coach that day was Eric Simons, a more decent, tolerant, and thoughtful man you couldn't hope to meet. With the benefit of hindsight, Simons said after his stint as coach that it was a job he should never have taken. He took it, of course, because he feared it would never be offered again, but he was young then and, in his own words, quote, prescriptive. By this he means that he fell into the trap of telling people how to do things, rather than, say, offering them a range of alternatives from which they could choose one. For Simons, coaching used to be about giving instruction. Now it is about ensuring that in times of great stress, and the final over of a T20 international is a time of great stress, that players know they have a range of options available to them. They've executed these options before, and this gives them the confidence to try and execute one of them successfully again. Simons is part of Walter's backup team in the Caribbean, which is good news. Simons was there in the 50-over World Cup in India last October, and his presence was one of the reasons why the Proteas did so well. Another obvious reason why they did so well is that Walter, their coach, is smart and savvy and knows what he's doing. This has shown in selection. To give one example, he has picked Gerald Coetzee rather than Lungi Ngidi, who is a travelling reserve, along with Nandre Berger. Ngidi had a pretty decent World Cup last year, but Coetzee had a better one. The right choice has been made. There are other reasons for cautious optimism. For one, with the exception of Kagiso Rabada's niggle, which has seen him come home from the Indian Premier League, the team are all fit. They might be exhausted, but they are all present, and not all of them will do duty in the warm-up matches in the Caribbean, so very little should be read into those matches. In last year's World Cup, for instance, Anrich Nortje didn't play. Anrich is with us for this tournament. Having all players present and accounted for gives you options. In World Cups, which are stressful and prolonged, we will look at how prolonged in a moment, options are what you want to have. As well as having options, the team looks settled. Quinton de Kock and Reza Hendricks, a left and a right-hander, will open the batting. Captain Aidan Markram, Heinrich Klaassen, Tristan Stubbs and David Miller will make up the meat of the middle order, with Marco Jansen and maybe Keshav Maharaj batting at 8. Next, the bowlers, Coetzee, Rabada, Nortje, possibly Tabrice Shamsi, maybe Bjorn Fortuin or Otniel Bartman, a deserved selection given domestic form, but possibly a slightly surprising one. It is good to see that form has been recognised. This surely accounts for, say, why Ryan Rickleton is in the squad. It will be interesting to see if he plays, because he's probably not a frontline choice. There is very little you can tell Markram, Klaassen, Rabada and Nortje about the vagaries and demands of international cricket. They've seen it all. They've played against pretty much everyone. Now is the time to surprise a nation who have ceased to believe in cricket surprises. Players like Rickleton and Bartman are wise choices because this is a long and convoluted tournament in which all squad members will need to play their part. For a start, there are 4 groups of 5 teams each, with South Africa, one of the group's 2-seeded teams, along with Sri Lanka. The other teams in the Proteas group are Bangladesh, Nepal and the Netherlands, the Proteas bogey side. Should everything go according to form, South Africa and Sri Lanka will progress. If this happens, they will go into the Super 8s, where 6 other teams, 2 from each of the 3 other groups in other words, will join them. These 8 teams will be divided into 2 groups of 4. Each team in a group will play 3 matches. The top 2 teams from each of the 2 groups will contest the semi-finals, with the winners playing in the final. The tournament format was different in the 2022 T20 World Cup in Australia, but, this said, South Africa didn't get out of her group then. There was a little bit of everything for the Proteas' long-suffering fans in that campaign. They were very good in beating India. They were unlucky in sharing the points in a rain-affected game against Zimbabwe, and they were disappointing in losing both to the Netherlands and Pakistan. The disappointment of losing to Pakistan was distended and soon became the excruciating disappointment of losing to the Netherlands in their very last fixture. Chief destroyers, need I remind you, in that game were Colin Ackerman and Brandon Glover, 2 former South Africans, Glover taking 3 for 9 as the Proteas lost by 13 runs. What Walter has brought to the table is consistency. It was something Mark Boucher, the previous coach, never had, the 2022 T20 World Cup being a case in point. Looking back on the tournament, we can see that selection was fatefully muddled. What was it muddled by? Well, it was muddled in the first instance by the politics of race, in that Themba Bavuma was captain of the side and opened the batting. It is a widely recognized fact that Bavuma is not a T20 international cricketer. Witness his marginal status in the SA20 and the fact that he no longer plays T20 cricket for his country. If you don't believe me, the stats tell the story. Compare his 150 and 36 T20 internationals at a strike rate of 118.16 with, say, Reza Hendricks's numbers. Hendricks has played in 56 T20 internationals compared to Bavuma's 36, but he scored 13 more 50s from the same position at the front of the order. Hendricks's strike rate sits marginally under 131 compared to Bavuma's 118. Should further comparisons be necessary, let's look at Rickleton, another opening batter. His domestic numbers, which include the SA20, are impressive. He has a strike rate, for example, of 137. That's decent in anyone's book, and tells us further that the powers that be have been right in not to pick Bavuma for this tournament. Forgive me while I interrupt a sports story to tell you about the Luke Alfred Show Patreon. As you may know, being a writer is not the most lucrative career choice. Please consider making a small donation to keep the show going at patreon.com/The Luke Alfred Show. But for now, let's get back to the story. Boucher's team were embroiled in more subtle muddles. Riley Rousseau looked like an inspired selection. Such inspiration was revealed to be inspired when Rousseau himself had an inspired tournament, scoring 109 against Bangladesh. Problem was, he was no long-term selection, but an inspired stopgap, a player with whom you stock a side but don't build a team. Amongst the other subtle muddles were the selections last time round of Dwayne Proteas and Wayne Parnell, both bowling all-rounders. A case might be made for one of the two, but both, at the expense of someone else. Both were players who Boucher trusted and admired, cricketers in his mould, in other words. But did this mean they should have been selected? At the risk of sounding smart after the fact, probably not. It is noticeable this time round that there are no bits and pieces players in Walterson and Quay's squad. Proteas and Parnell were both players who gave you something of one thing and a little bit of another. They were betwixt and between. Such ambiguity was not helpful to their team. There is in fact only one true all-rounder in this T20 team, and that's Jansen. Everyone else is either a specialist batter or a specialist bowler. Coetzee, Fortuin, Rabada and Maharaj can all bat, but they can't bat well enough to win you a close game in the dying overs. They won't be blamed for not getting you over the line, while Jansen will. There is another aspect of the team selection that is very much on my mind. It is very much on my mind partly because it hasn't been discussed, and partly because I see it so easily, as so few others seem to have done. What I'm saying is that this team also offers an implicit criticism of transformation in cricket. It might do more. It might signal the death knell for equity in the national cricket team forevermore. Few remember now that when England toured South Africa in the summer of 1999 and 2000, Ali Bacher, the then Supremo of the United Cricket Board, invited Queen Elizabeth II to Alexandra, the township in Joburg on the edge of Sandton. The invitation showed Bacher at his magnificent best, conjuring a photo opportunity out of nothing. Some of England's cricketers accompanied the Queen on her walkabout, as did every Fleet Street photographer in South Africa at the time. She was also followed, at a respectful distance of course, by tens of little boys clutching cricket bats in Fedsure T-shirts. The scene was one of promise. It said something important. It said, this might be a township, the expression of racial segregation going back decades, but it is also a place of promise, and therefore hope. Hope, in the cricket sense, was tangible in townships like Alexandra 25 years ago. This was partly because Ahem Bacher was in charge, and it was partly because Alex, we South Africans like to use the abbreviation, had its own cricket club. There was a transport system in place which ferried boys from disadvantaged backgrounds to and from matches. There was a mentoring system in place too, in which ex-players like Hugh Page, Adam Bacher and Clive Eckstein would mentor promising young boys under the auspices, I think I'm correct in saying this, of Imtiaz Patel, the Transvaal Cricket Board's then development officer. Elsewhere there were good initiatives too. The driving force behind the Soweto Cricket Club was Khaya Majola, Gerald's brother. Khaya played the role of paterfamilias at Soweto CC. After a few beers and a braai on the Saturday night, he would bed down with the players to make sure they didn't do too much carousing ahead of their fixture the following day. Under Khaya, Soweto CC was a proud club. And because they were proud, anything was possible, even at their home ground, Elka Stadium, the outfield of which was horrendously difficult to mow, so that cover drives frequently got stuck close to the ropes and you could only run 2 runs. Under Bacher, a township was not a place about which to be embarrassed. Touring teams visited Alex and Zwide in the Eastern Cape and Soweto, as they did on that tour when England played a 3-day warm-up game against a Transvaal Invitation 11 at Elka Stadium. Slowly, these initiatives began to change. Gerald Majola, Bacher's successor, seemed to be less enthusiastic about having visiting teams to South Africa play in the townships, and slowly the initiative was discontinued. Perhaps it is wrong to blame Majola alone. Perhaps the neglect was institutional and emotional. Perhaps for the new Black Caucus, who increasingly flexed their muscle when Bacher was gone, a township was something you wanted to leave behind. Maybe there was no benefit to be gained by bringing cricket in this form to the townships. When the townships weren't neglected, they were impossible to manage. Equipment got stolen, the council didn't mow the lawn, water pipes and hoses simply vanished, broken windows never got repaired. The pride that had once been part and parcel of Soweto CC under Gerald's brother, Khaya, began to fade, partly because Khaya died tragically young, aged 47, and with him gone, the club no longer had anyone who believed in it. Many years later, I watched a Premier League game there because our son was playing for the Wanderers. The little grandstand was tatty, the grass unmowed. The clock was stuck, as it had been for so many years. The Soweto CC captain threw a tantrum, leading his side off the field because an umpire failed to give him a decision he believed was his. And so cricket in the post-Gerald Majola years turned away from the townships, the place from which cricketers should rightfully come if cricket is truly to become a game played in every nook and cranny of the country. As this was going on, however, the campaign for black cricketers was intensifying, and rightfully so. It was ridiculous that there were so few quality black cricketers competing for places in the national side. Something must be done. Talented players were identified in the private and former Model C schools. And so cricket became professionalized or semi-professionalized when the cricketers themselves were younger and younger. They went to winter training camps and academies and hubs. They were nurtured and groomed and force-fed cricket. Feeling that it was their responsibility to raise targets and quotas, the language differed from time to time. Successive boards at Cricket South Africa believed that they were giving disadvantaged cricketers opportunities by exposing them to a level of the game with which they could not cope. And so we see the consequence of cricket's gerrymandering over the years with the selection of the T20 team to the 2024 World Cup. The team contains 1 black cricketer, Rabada, and 2 nominally coloured cricketers in Hendricks and Fortuin. Where are the products of transformation? Where are the cricket products of the millions and millions of rands spent making the system more equitable in the last 25 years? They're certainly not in the national team. Notice, I don't call this all a failure, but it has been crudely applied. Watch some domestic four-day cricket if you doubt me. We have transformed at coaching level, but the stripping out of intellectual capital has left the system denuded at the very point where it should be strong. At this level, CSA is like the failed state. Entrusted with development, they have failed to deliver on their mandate, but they cannot admit to failing to deliver their mandate because they are the very people entrusted with development, and to do so would be to risk deep public embarrassment. Might we have come full circle in the selection of the latest squad for the T20 World Cup in a week's time, the selection of which can be read as an implicit criticism of the entire developmental project? We might, although we might also be witnessing a dose of healthy pragmatism, which will be reverse engineered later when the numbers need to be massaged to satisfy the apparatchiks. All that, however, lies in the future. For the time being, let's hope. Let's hope that this is a side good enough to bring back the bacon. There's talent, skill, experience, expertise and desire in his squad. Many of them have played with the world's best. Markram, their skipper, has captained the Sunrisers Eastern Cape to 2 consecutive SA20 titles. Klaasen is the most dynamic white ball technician in the world at the moment. If ever there was a time to play with freedom and fun, the time is now. We, of course, say this every time. Where it is appreciably different this time round is at Walter's preparation and the institutional commitment to getting the job done. Cricket South Africa is desperately jealous of SA Rugby. They are jealous of their success. They are jealous of their social profile. The best way to deal with your jealousy, for few like being jealous and no one will admit it, is to be successful yourself. Rugby has provided a template for success in winning back-to-back World Cups. They have created a road. Cricket now needs to take to that road, to run on that road, and finally break into a joyous sprint. If you enjoyed this episode of The Luke Alfred Show, please give me a 5-star rating. As an independent creator, this podcast is made possible through your support.